Today, you're going to learn about the 7 points in the new AP US History DBQ rubric released in 2017. And to help you learn about the new rubric, we brought in AP US History experts Chris Averill and Paul Fay. For each point, Chris and Paul break down exactly what you need to do to earn the point, as well as show you the common mistakes students make and how to avoid them. So keep watching.
Thesis point is extremely important because it sets the tone and direction of the paper. There's basically 3 things a student needs to do with their thesis. They need to establish a defensible claim, they have to establish a line of reasoning, and they have to evaluate whatever topic's being given.
Historically defensible claim is looking at, on a very basic level, do you understand the history? You can't just take any claim and any pieces of evidence. You do have to know your history. It's going to have to be accurate and correct. They're going to ask you to make a claim and an argument, but you have to back that up with relevant information that is historically accurate. So they're asking for a line of reasoning in the thesis statement because you're going to have to make an argument, and you'll establish your argument or claim. And within that, then, the line of reasoning is, or your body paragraphs. What are the main ideas that will defend this claim and lay the groundwork for this essay that it'll be centered around? So with a line of reasoning, when we're talking about categories or topics, what are your top causes that are going to go into your body paragraphs and form these categories, topics, main ideas, is how different ways teachers may say it to you.
The evaluation component is really how much something has changed, how much something has stayed the same, why one element is more important than another. So it's an evaluation of the historical trends or development within the prompt.
What I tell my students about writing a good thesis is, with your line of reasoning, with your main topics, what seems to be a common feature that binds them together? You don't want to be too general. So for example, in some of the poor thesis there, they will state, just many causes, or there will be vague, sometimes saying political, economic, and social. You also have to be careful then, you don't want to go too specific and bring in specific pieces of evidence that you want to use in your body paragraphs. It's a little bit of walking a tightrope at times for students. It's not that you have to go write a full essay every time you want to do it. You can take topics and look at them and try to put together and think about, all right, I need an argument, I need this line of reasoning, these body paragraphs. It's like athletics or anything else you're going to do. There are certain fundamentals that you're going to have to do, and so it's going to take repeated practice. Sometimes if it's examples or ideas that are already out there, how would I take this topic, main idea, and form this thesis? A thesis needs to be, and it can be, in the introduction or in the conclusion. For the length of the thesis, there's not a defined number of sentences or words that anybody's counting or looking at. It's, do you meet the requirements? So they are looking for a claim or an argument, and then the line of reasoning or topics, main ideas, things that will support and define that argument and claim. Typically, on average, I would say it in a couple sentences. It's difficult to do it in one sentence. It can be done in 2 clearly, concisely worded, 2 sentences framework. But it is necessary that the sentences can be identified as a thesis statement. It's not a general overall feeling about the essay that you have some kind of argument and topics. You have to clearly be able to point 2 sentences in the introduction or conclusion and say, this is my thesis. Contextualization is the idea of what they're looking for. Do you understand this in the broader topic events of what's going on? So for example, if you have a question that is directly asking you about the causes to the revolution, can you connect this to the bigger ideas of what were going on locally, regionally, or across the country or across the world that was influencing people to rebel?
The difference between contextualization and background is that background tends to be more specific as to historical subjects, proper nouns, etc., with no eliciting of how those particular facts connect to the question's trend or development. It operates more as a factual piece of information. The relationship as to how it influences needs to be presented.
The broader historical context is looking, can you take a situation like a revolution happening and connect it to themes, events that are going on that are not just maybe local to that area of this question. So again, if you're talking about the revolution, that the broader historical context would be what are the issues over rights, the ideas and visions about rights in relation to government, whether that's economic rights, social rights, political rights.
What I tell my students concerning the contextualization point is to make sure that they think about the larger social, economic, and political trends occurring during the time frame of the question or just prior to it. And once they can figure out a larger trend, how does that trend or development influence the question? And I also specify that it's got to be a minimum of 2 sentences, because more often than not, a student writing a single sentence is not going to be able to elaborate on those 2 points in that brief of a time period.
Bring the reader into this time period. Try to set up the scene of what's going on. Why is this significant? Why is this happening? How is it important? Try to run those questions through your head, and if you can answer any part of those to help lead into why are you making this argument, why are you having this thesis statement, that can help you build naturally in getting the contextualization.
The first point of evidence for a student is to make sure that they correctly identify and use at least 3 documents. A student has to make some type of connection to the prompt itself. It cannot simply state document A says with no connection to anything. So at the very baseline, most students can get this 1 point because they're interpreting the document, they're pulling out the subject, they're pulling out the topic, and it may be the most approachable point for them to receive.
You can't just quote, like you actually bring out content, not just say what's in it, like because you'll see students do that, they just quote. Like document says, and they quote like a key phrase and they leave it at that, you know, like,
With no ownership.
Like nothing there, I mean.
Here's how I describe to my students an internal gauge as to how they will accurately use a document in order to get the point. Have they pulled out the idea or perspective of the document and connected it to the larger cause and theme? My goal is not simply to describe a document, but to use the ideas embedded in it to advance an argument. So there's a difference between the 2 points and 1 points for document use in the DBQ rubric. In order to receive the first point, or 1 point, a student has to correctly use 3 documents in answer to the prompt. To receive the second point, a student needs to use at least 6 documents, the content of the documents. They have to pull out ideas from the documents that support their argument.
To get to the higher level, it asks you to support an argument, not just use the content. So what that usually means is that you, one, will set up the content. You have to establish the content and main idea. But then how do you use this to support the argument? So what about this content helps you make the argument, not just saying what is in the document and what the content of the idea is?
I'm telling my students the single most important point is that they pull out the idea or perspective that supports their argument. They're not simply describing a document. They are actually using it to advance an argument by explaining how that idea supports their argument.
Like Chris said, you want to be thinking about it. The test makers have given me a document to help fit into this question. So don't just get tunnel vision as to the words in this document. Really think, this is supposed to show me a cause, this is supposed to show me continuity or change or compare and contrast, whatever the skill is. How or why can I explain that it is doing that and contributing to whatever I'm arguing? The third point of evidence beyond the documents, some might be referred to as outside evidence. So you're looking for, and what they're looking for, do you have any historical evidence about this topic that you know on your own, without the documents giving you that information?
One of the common mistakes that students make using outside evidence is they're too vague. They might say something like, the colonists were angry over taxes, such as the stamp tax. That's not going to get the point because it's not connected to advancing a larger argument as to principles involved, the trend or development. How that piece of outside evidence advances the argument is the key to getting the point. So a student then would have to say the Stamp Act of 1765 was in fact a tax that taxed them internally. And this is what really ticked off the colonists, was because they believed that they had the right to tax themselves internally. So it develops the piece of evidence to connect to a larger argument, not simply stating a specific piece of evidence. Students have a tough time differentiating between, should I use just proper nouns and start from there, like the Stamp Act, and go deductively as to how that connects, and that's perfectly fine. Or a student could go inductively and come with the concept of taxation for purposes of outside evidence and discuss the difference in the concept of internal versus external. That is more of a principled approach to a piece of outside evidence. It doesn't have to be a specific proper noun, but it tends to be. But most importantly, it needs to advance the argument and be connected, whether it's a trend or development or a specific piece of factual information. One of the things that's very important for students to understand is that they cannot double dip. So the readers at the reading, when they bump into something outside of the documents, like a trend, development, or piece of specific factual information, they are asking themselves, is this elaborate enough to qualify as a piece of outside evidence or as a contextualization statement? And the elaboration then can be as simple as a single sentence or 2 sentences or 3 sentences. But as long as the thought continues, the reader is in fact treating that as that point. They are not separating out, oh, that's the contextualization sentence and a half, and then here's the outside evidence to prove that contextualization. And so it gets the point for the sentence and a half and a point. They're two distinct points. So as soon as the element is brought up that's a contextualization element, what flows after that is all connected to it. And the evidence that supports that contextualization statement is all considered contextualization. As a grader, good characteristics of outside evidence would be a clear delineation of a piece of information outside the documents. It can be a proper noun, it could be a trend, development, principle, idea, but it also explains how that connects to and supports the larger thesis or argument. It's very clear. It tends to not be a vague description, and it is well connected to an argument.
With the analysis point, what they're trying to attempt to do or have you show on the DBQ is analyzing the documents for themselves. You've already analyzed them for the content to support the argument, but now can you kind of qualify that document or bring up things about that document that might be relevant or significant in influencing what is being said in that document? The biggest takeaway about the analysis point and what we're hoping to achieve is that you must consider sources and what is going on with them when trying to analyze and understand history. That just because you read something, You don't just take it as that is actual fact, that is the pure story, there's nothing else to consider. For example, they give you 4 categories or 4 ways you could possibly do that. Many teachers use acronyms to try and remember those, like HIP or HAP, but the 4 ways are historical context, intended audience, purpose, and point of view. So historical context, this can be confusing because you have a contextualization point and now they're telling you about historical context. Some try to frame it or have students understand it as there is big C and little c. Big C is that contextualization point, its own individual point, and you're trying to connect the main argument as we've talked about. Historical context, some refer to it as little c, meaning what is the context, what is happening at the time of this document that might be influencing it. So it's more directed specifically towards that document rather than the big theme of the whole essay.
The intended audience would be the people that a document or perspective is hoping to influence. And so a student could present this in reference to attempting to persuade a certain group of people to do a certain thing. So that gives the intended audience plus what the significance is, what it is that they want to do. So for example, if Frederick Douglass is speaking before a crowd in the 1840s, it might sound like Douglass is attempting to influence the northern populace to support the emancipation of slaves. The purpose of the document is the intended motivation or action that an author is hoping that will take place as a result of their words in the document. The point of view is probably the most difficult one for the students to accomplish because the point of view tends to be the larger group that the perspective of the document represents and what that group's hopes are. So the point of view, it tends to be the connection between the author's perspective and a larger group that is out there and pushing an agenda.
So the point of view, representing who they are, or what their belief system might be, or what their profession might be, or what their job. When you see that in the source line, it's kind of giving you a clue that might be significant or influential, as to what they're saying and might have an influence. To get the point with HIP, what you want to do when applying this and what it's talking about in the rubric and what they're telling you is how is this really relevant or significant to the content of the document. So you want to make some type of connection between the type of HIP you're doing and how that is significant, influential, relevant to what is being said in the argument.
So the tips I give my students relative to this difficult skill known as HIP are the following. 1, when they hit a document, can they state what caused that document, that perspective to be made? If they can, that's the historical context. If they can't, they move on to the following. Can they state the author's purpose? What action they're attempting someone someplace to take? And so if I establish purpose, it's got to be a verb. The purpose is not the perspective of the document that students commonly misalign it with. The purpose is what is the author's purpose as to an action that needs to be taken. That's 2. If I can figure out what the audience is, I tell my students then go ahead and determine what they want that audience to do. The last but not least, the point of view tends to be the hardest because they tend not to establish the significance of that point of view. They tend to identify the group accurately, but they don't do anything with it. And that's why students most commonly find this the most difficult. So if they have the group that the perspective of the document is in fact representing, they need to explain why that opinion is significant. For example, if this is a union leader, then the student might maintain that this person, this author, is in fact establishing union movement's beliefs, which they've always pushed for, such as reform in labor conditions. So they're establishing the significance when they establish the point of view.
The most common mistakes we see when students are attempting to get the analysis point, they feel by just using the words from him, like saying after they've written about the document, they'll say the purpose of the document is, and feel that because they said the word purpose, they are now covering that point. And so just by saying the intended audience or the purpose or point of view does not automatically mean then you get that point. The common mistake becomes they're just repeating the content of the document. And so this is a common mistake. What you really want to make sure of when you're working with HIP is that you're not just repeating the content or argument that you are making with evidence, because that's the evidence point and use of document. And so now the key is to analyze the document itself and how one of these strategies of HIP is influencing and giving insight to what you might be getting this document, or why the content is saying this, or where this content is coming from.
To make it clear to the reader in an attempt to get the HIP point, they have to have a clear understanding of what each of these four elements are. If a student is establishing the background of a document, what caused this document, we would read that as the historical context. If this student uses phraseology like, this is an attempt to influence and then fill in the blank for an audience, and then explain what they're trying to do to get those people to do, then that would be the audience. If it is the author's purpose, it tends to have a verb like to motivate, to incite, to push for some action. And for point of view, it tends to be an association with a larger group, but what is the characteristic of that larger group? So if it was Frederick Douglass, he's a member of the abolitionists who, in fact, are pushing to emancipate the slaves. That's the significance part. And that's the key to all four of these. It's not just the identification of it. It also has to have a significance, like Paul already established, as to a connection. Simply saying that Frederick Douglass, a black abolitionist, stated doesn't get you the point of view point, because it identifies the group, but not why that group is significant.
The last point on the rubric, the reasoning point, it is now for the reader to look overall, do you have a good grasp and historical knowledge of what is happening here in this question?
The reasoning point relative to a complex understanding starts with this basic premise. Does the student take ownership of the question first, or does the student simply have a document-driven essay? That premise is the first dividing line for the readers at the reading. Many times, students simply bring the documents, the ideas that the documents present, and that's how they organize it, and simply put, it's document-driven. It's easy to see, it's boilerplate. In order to get this reasoning point and to establish a complex understanding, they need to corroborate and or qualify or modify their arguments throughout the paper. And what that means is they show a deeper, nuanced understanding of the topic at hand. The reasoning point is most definitely holistic in the sense that it's the strength of the argument overall, and the examples of specificity as to statements that build that deeper nuance. Having an organized essay does not get you this point either. It actually has to show a deeper, more meaningful understanding of the topic than simply document-driven and generalist approach to answering it.
Yeah, to get the reasoning point, you will have to understand a complexity, but one thing that may help you in doing that in achieving this, when you're going through the documents in the paragraphs, doing some simple things like making connections, transition words. For the example, in the American Revolution, like this document is a cause, and then you're going to the next document. Building off of that document. Building off of that, then so-and-so does this and this. Or this would continue later on as we see, in the next document that they're also doing it later. You show a connection between this document and that document. So sometimes simple transition words help show that you understand the connection between these and how they corroborate each other. So not only trying to make connections with transition words between documents, but between paragraphs can be a way that you show these things are connected, and I'm not just being document driven, listing one document at a time.